Late summer, 1990s, Southside, Chicago. A black sedan moves slowly through a dimly lit street, the kind of street where lights flicker and trust disappears. Inside, a young man sits in the back seat, Angelo Roberts, only 22 years old, but already carrying the weight of a system built on fear, loyalty, and control. The car stops. A moment of silence follows. Then, gunfire shatters the night. Multiple shots, precise, controlled, deliberate. The vehicle jolts as bullets tear through metal and glass. Inside, there's no time to react. This wasn't random. This was calculated, executed with a level of precision that suggests one thing. Someone knew exactly where he would be. And more importantly, someone made sure he wouldn't leave. But the real shock wasn't the attack itself. It was what led to it. Because in the weeks leading up to that night, whispers had already started inside the system. Shifting loyalties, unanswered questions, and a growing tension that no one could fully control. So the question remains, how does a 22-year-old rise to power and end up targeted by the very structure that once protected him? Streets recognized Angelo Roberts as a name tied to power. He was just another kid shaped by the South Side of Chicago. Late 1980s to early 1990s, a period where neighborhoods weren't just communities, they were territories. Blocks were controlled, boundaries were understood, and survival wasn't optional. The South Side didn't operate like a normal city. It functioned under its own rules. For many young men, education wasn't the primary path forward. Opportunity didn't come through schools or institutions. It came through proximity. Proximity to power, proximity to influence, proximity to those already controlling movement in the streets. Angelo grew up in this environment, where every decision carried weight, every interaction mattered. Trust was rare, and loyalty was something that had to be proven, not claimed. Inside this ecosystem, multiple organized groups operated across Chicago, including structures aligned with factions like the Gangster Disciples and the Vice Lords, groups that had established hierarchy, rules, and territorial control. But these weren't just street gangs, they were systems. Systems with internal ranks, discipline, and consequences for failure. For someone like Angelo, entry into this world wasn't marked by a single moment, it was gradual. Small choices, small tests, small risks, each one building towards something larger. And in environments like this, young individuals often learn a critical lesson early. Respect is not given, it is enforced. But enforcement comes with consequences, because every step upward brings visibility, and visibility attracts attention, not just from rivals, but from those inside the same structure. As Angelo's presence began to grow within his surroundings, so did something else: awareness. People started to notice him, not just as another individual, but as someone who understood how the system operated. That understanding is dangerous, because in structured criminal environments, knowledge is power, but it is also risk. The same people who elevate you can just as easily begin to question you, or monitor you, or worse, see you as a threat. And at that point, everything changes. Because in this world, the difference between opportunity and danger is often very thin. Angelo wasn't just surviving anymore. He was learning, observing, adapting, and slowly, without drawing unnecessary attention, he began positioning himself within a structure that rewarded control, discipline, and calculated decisions. But the deeper someone moves into that structure, the harder it becomes to remain invisible. And eventually, visibility turns into exposure. Angelo didn't rise through chaos. He rose through control. In the streets of Chicago's South Side, power doesn't always belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the one who understands timing. In the early stages of his rise, Angelo operated differently from others around him. Where many sought attention, he avoided it. Where others relied on force, he focused on influence. This approach made him harder to read, and in organized structures, that alone sets someone apart. Within groups like the Gangster Disciples and the Vice Lords, leadership isn't always about age or experience, it's about results, money flow, control of movement, ability to maintain order. Angelo began aligning himself with individuals who recognized his potential, people who weren't just looking for muscle, but for strategy. Over time, he built connections, not just with individuals, but with networks, small alliances that expanded his reach without exposing his position. This is where many fail, because growth in these environments comes with a cost. Every step forward creates imbalance, and imbalance attracts attention. At first, Angelo remained below the radar of higher-level authorities, but internally, his presence was becoming harder to ignore. Reports began circulating within local circles, a young figure, calculating, disciplined, not impulsive like others. That distinction matters because in a system built on unpredictability, predictability becomes power, and power becomes threat. As Angelo's influence grew, so did the number of people who depended on him, and dependency creates structure. Structure creates hierarchy, and hierarchy creates tension. Because in these systems, power is never stable. It is constantly negotiated, silently, and sometimes violently. At this stage, Angelo wasn't just participating in the system, he was becoming part of its foundation. But the deeper he moved, the more he exposed himself to forces far beyond the streets. Law enforcement, informants, internal watchers, and most importantly, people within his own network who were beginning to question one thing: how fast he was rising. Because rapid rise in these environments doesn't go unnoticed. It raises questions, questions that can turn into suspicion, and suspicion is where the real danger begins. Turning point. The moment everything shifted wasn't loud, it was quiet, almost invisible. In the mid to late 1990s, Chicago was already deep in a cycle of escalating gang activity and law enforcement pressure. Authorities were tightening surveillance, federal agencies were increasing coordination, and internal informants were becoming more common. This created a fragile balance. Fragile systems break under pressure. For Angelo Roberts, this was the point where survival stopped being enough. He had to evolve, fast. Within his network, something began to change. Trust started to erode. Small inconsistencies, missed signals, delayed responses. Things that might have been ignored before now carried weight. Because Angelo was no longer just a participant, he was becoming someone others depended on. And that creates pressure from both sides, upwards and downwards. Higher-ranking figures expect loyalty and results. Lower-ranking members expect guidance and protection. Angelo was now in the middle, and that position is one of the most dangerous in any hierarchy. Around this time, internal conflicts began to surface, not openly, not in a way that could be easily traced, but in subtle ways. Disagreements, shifts in alliances, changes in tone. People who once aligned with Angelo began to hesitate or question or distance themselves. And in organized crime structures, distance is never just emotional, it is strategic, because distance creates space for betrayal. At the same time, law enforcement pressure intensified, investigations were expanding, surveillance was increasing, and arrests in related circles began to rise. This created fear, and fear changes behavior. People become more cautious, more secretive, and more willing to protect themselves at the expense of others. Angelo now stood at a crossroads. He had gained influence, but influence brings visibility, and visibility invites risk. Because the more important you become, the more valuable you are to both sides, to your allies and to your enemies. This is where the turning point truly begins, not with one decision, but with a shift in perception. People no longer saw Angelo as just another member of the system. They started seeing him as something else, a potential leader, or a potential liability. And in these environments, those two things can become indistinguishable. By the time Angelo's name started circulating beyond the streets, the situation was no longer just criminal. It had become political. In Chicago, organized crime has never existed in isolation. It overlaps with neighborhoods, economics, and, most importantly, power structures that extend into politics and law enforcement. In the late 1990s, federal pressure on gangs like the Gangster Disciples intensified significantly. Operations were coordinated through agencies like the FBI, targeting leadership structures and financial networks. This wasn't random, it was strategic. Authorities weren't just arresting individuals, they were dismantling systems. And Angelo, whether intentionally or not, had become part of that system. His growing influence meant increased attention, not just from rival groups, but from surveillance units analyzing patterns, connections, and communication flows. Every move mattered. Every association mattered. Every contact became a data point, and data builds cases. Internally, things were shifting again. Higher-level figures within the structure began reassessing their positions, because Angelo's rise wasn't just impressive, it was fast. And speed in this world is dangerous. It disrupts hierarchy, it challenges established order, and, most importantly, it forces others to react. Reactions create instability, and instability creates opportunity, but also suspicion. Rumors began to spread, whispers of internal monitoring, concerns about exposure, questions about loyalty. In systems like this, loyalty is the most valuable currency, and once it is questioned, it rarely recovers. At the same time, pressure from law enforcement increased. Arrests in connected circles intensified. Individuals close to Angelo began to disappear from the network, some through arrests, others through silence. Each removal weakened the structure, and as the structure weakened, responsibility shifted. And responsibility in these environments often means one thing: accountability for everything that goes wrong. Angelo now found himself in a dangerous position, caught between external pressure and internal suspicion. The system that once enabled his rise was now beginning to tighten around him. Because in organized crime, power is never permanent, it is temporary. And once someone becomes too visible, they stop being an asset and start becoming a liability. By the early 2000s, Angelo Roberts was no longer surrounded by the same people who helped build his rise. That's how these systems work. Growth creates distance, distance creates silence, and silence creates uncertainty. Inside the network, something subtle began to shift. People stopped sharing information freely. Conversations became shorter, meetings became less frequent, and when they did happen, they felt different, colder, more calculated. Angelo noticed it, but he didn't react immediately, because reacting too early can expose weakness, and weakness invites pressure. Instead, he did what he had always done. He observed, analyzed, adapted. But this time, the environment was different. The level of risk had increased, the stakes were higher, and the tolerance for mistakes had dropped. Around this time, internal fractures began to appear. Not everyone in the structure agreed on direction. Not everyone trusted Angelo's position. Some believed he had become too influential. Others believed he was still an asset. But belief is not enough to protect you in this world. Proof matters, and so do accusations. Whispers began circulating about attention from law enforcement, about possible surveillance, about internal vulnerability. Whether these claims were true or not didn't matter as much as the effect they created, because in organized crime systems, perception often drives action, and once doubt enters the equation, loyalty starts to fracture. At the same time, Angelo became more isolated, not by choice alone, but by circumstance. People who once stood close to him began stepping back. Contacts became harder to reach, messages took longer to return, and meetings required more caution than ever before. This is a critical phase in any criminal power structure: isolation. Because isolation removes support, and without support, a person becomes easier to target. Internally, this created a dangerous imbalance. Angelo still held influence, but influence without trust is fragile. Externally, law enforcement pressure remained steady. Investigations continued. Networks were being mapped, connections were being traced, and every layer revealed something new, or at least something that seemed new. Because in many cases, the most dangerous development is not what is discovered, but what is believed to be discovered, and that belief can lead to irreversible decisions. Angelo was now in a position where both sides were watching, but neither side fully trusted him, and in a system built on trust and control, that is where survival becomes uncertain. Because once isolation begins, betrayal is no longer a possibility, it becomes a probability. It happened in a moment, but the decision behind it had been building for a long time. By this point, Angelo Roberts was no longer just watched, he was studied. Every pattern, every movement, every connection. In organized crime, when someone reaches a certain level of visibility, the system begins to evaluate one question: Are they still useful, or have they become a risk? The answer to that question doesn't come from outside, it comes from within. And internally, the situation had already shifted. Trust had eroded, distance had grown, and suspicion had settled in. In environments like this, once a person is perceived as a liability, options narrow quickly. Warnings are not always given, and when they are often subtle. A change in tone, a missed meeting, a shift in behavior from those around you. But sometimes, there is no warning at all. The system simply moves. In the period leading up to the event, tensions within Angelo's network reached a breaking point. Internal disagreements, concerns about exposure, pressure from multiple directions, and at the center of it all, Angelo. Whether he knew it fully or not, his position had become unstable, not because he lost power, but because he gained too much visibility. And in these systems, visibility is dangerous, because visible people can be traced, and traced people can be removed. The exact details of what triggered the final decision remain uncertain. Some accounts suggest internal conflict reached a critical point. Others suggest external pressure accelerated internal actions. What is clear is that the outcome was decisive and final. The attack itself was not random, it was calculated, executed with precision, a moment designed not just to remove an individual, but to send a message. Because in organized crime, violence is never just violence. It is communication. It tells others what happens when boundaries are crossed, or when systems feel threatened, or when power needs to be reasserted. Angelo's death marked the end of one phase, but also the beginning of another. Because in these environments, no single event exists in isolation. Each action creates consequences, each consequence creates reactions, and those reactions reshape the structure itself. After the incident, silence followed. But silence in this context is never empty. It is filled with fear, uncertainty, and anticipation. Because everyone is now asking the same question: who is next?
Was killed. The system didn't collapse. It adapted. That's what organized crime does. It survives by absorbing shock. And in the aftermath, everything shifts. Fast. Within days, rumors spread across the network. Some claimed it was internal conflict. Others suggested external pressure played a role. A few believed it was a coordinated decision. But in this world, the truth is often fragmented. And fragments create confusion. Confusion creates fear. And fear creates silence. Law enforcement began tightening its focus, not just on the individuals directly involved, but on the entire structure surrounding Angelo. Because when a figure like him falls, it doesn't end the investigation, it expands it. Authorities analyze communication patterns, financial movements, associations, and behavioral changes following the incident. Each detail matters. Each connection can lead to another layer. Inside the organization, the reaction was immediate. Some members went underground. Others distanced themselves completely. A few were quietly removed, not publicly, not officially, but internally. Because after a high-profile incident, systems often enter a phase of cleansing, where loyalty is tested, and anything uncertain is eliminated. This creates a climate where trust becomes even more rare than before. People start watching each other, carefully, quietly. Because now, survival depends not just on strength, but on perception. Who you appear to support, who you appear to oppose, who you are seen talking to. Every detail becomes dangerous. And Angelo's absence leaves behind more than just a power gap. It leaves instability. Because when a central figure is removed, the structure doesn't simply continue as before. It fractures. New tensions emerge, new conflicts begin, and new power struggles take shape. Over time, the system attempts to stabilize. New figures step forward, new alliances are formed, and the cycle continues. But the memory of Angelo Roberts remains, not as a legend, not as a myth, but as a reminder that in organized crime, power is temporary, control is fragile, and survival is never guaranteed. Because the same system that elevates someone can also erase them without hesitation. Angelo Roberts isn't just about one man. It's about a system built on hierarchy, on control, on loyalty that is demanded, not given, and most importantly, a system that consumes its own. From the beginning, Angelo operated inside a structure where survival required adaptation.
But adaptation alone is never enough, because in organized crime, success and danger grow together. The higher you climb, the more you are seen, and being seen means being measured. Measured by allies, measured by rivals, measured by those who decide what happens next. Angelo's rise followed a pattern seen across many real-world cases. A young individual enters the system, learns quickly, adapts faster than others, gains influence, and eventually becomes too visible to ignore. But visibility changes everything. It shifts perception from opportunity to risk. And once that shift happens, the outcome is rarely reversible. Because these systems do not rely on justice, they rely on control. And control is maintained through fear, loyalty, and consequence. What makes this story powerful isn't just the rise or the fall, it's the structure behind it. The unspoken rules, the silent decisions, the invisible pressures, and the realization that in environments like this, the same path that leads to power also leads to isolation. Angelo's story reflects a deeper truth about organized crime. It is not built to reward individuals, it is built to protect itself. And anything that threatens that balance is eventually removed. Sometimes quickly, sometimes quietly, but almost always completely. In the end, what remains is not just the memory of a person, but the echo of a system that continues to exist, evolving, adapting, and repeating the same cycle. Because as long as the structure remains, the story will repeat. Different names, different faces, same outcome.